Story 1. The Beast in the Cave. Written by HP Lovecraft. The horrible conclusion which had been gradually intruding itself upon my confused and reluctant mind was now an awful certainty. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost in the vast labyrinthine recess of the Mammoth Cave. Turn as I might, in no direction could my straining vision seize any object capable of serving as a guidepost to set me on the outward path. That never more should I behold the blessed light of day, or scan the pleasant hills and dales of the beautiful world outside, my reason could no longer entertain the slightest unbelief. Hope had departed. Yet I indoctrinated, as I was by a life of philosophical study. I derived no small measure of satisfaction from my unimpassioned demeanor, for although I had frequently read of the wild frenzies into which were thrown the victims of similar situations, I experienced none of these, but stood as quiet as I clearly realized the loss of my bearings. Nor did the thought that I had probably wandered beyond the utmost limits of an ordinary search cause me to abandon my composure, even for a moment. If I must die, I reflected, then was this terrible yet majestic cavern as welcome a sepulchre as that which any churchyard might afford, a conception which carried with it more of a tranquility than of despair. Starving would prove my ultimate fate. Of this I was certain. Some I knew had gone mad under circumstances such as these, but I felt that this end would not be mine. My disaster was the result of no fault save my own, since unknown to the guide, I had separated myself from the regular party of sightseers, and wandering for over an hour in forbidden avenues of the cave, had found myself unable to retrace the devious windings which I had pursued, since forsaking my companions. Already my torch had begun to expire. Soon, I would be enveloped by the total and almost palpable blackness of the bowels of the earth. As I stood in the waning unsteady light, I idly wandered over the exact circumstances of my coming end. I remembered the accounts which I had heard from the colony of consumptives, who, taking their residence in this gigantic grotto, to find health from the apparently salubrious air of the underground world, with its steady, uniform temperature, pure air, and peaceful quiet, had found instead death in strange and ghastly form. I had seen the sad remains of their ill-made cottages as I passed them by with the party, and had wandered with unnatural influence a long sojourn in this immense and silent cavern would exert upon one as healthy and vigorous as I. Now I grimly told myself, my opportunity for settling this point had arrived, provided that want of food should not bring me to a speedy departure from this life. As the last fitful rays of my torch faded into obscurity, I resolved to leave no stone unturned, no possible means of escape neglected. So summoning all the powers possessed by my lungs, I set up a series of loud shoutings, in the vain hope of attracting the attention of the guide by my clamor. Yet as I called, I believed in my heart that my cries were to no purpose, magnified and reflected by the numberless ramparts of the black maze about me, fell upon no ears save my own. All at once, however, my attention was fixed with a start, as I fancied that I heard the sound of soft approaching steps on the rocky floor of the cavern. Was my deliverance about to be accomplished so soon? Had then all my horrible apprehensions been for naught? And was the guide, having marked my unwarranted absence from the party, following my course and seeking me out in this limestone labyrinth? Whilst these joyful queries arose in my brain, I was on the point of renewing my cries in order that my discovery might come the sooner, when an instant my delight was turned to horror as I listened. For my ever-acute ear, now sharpened in even greater degree by the complete silence of the cave, bore to my benumbed understanding the unexpected and dreadful knowledge that these footfalls were not like those of any mortal man. In the unearthly stillness of the subterranean region, the tread of the booted guide would have sounded like a series of sharp and incisive blows. These impacts were soft and stealthy, as of the paw of some feline. Besides, when I listened carefully, I seemed to trace the falls of 4 instead of 2 feet. I was now convinced that I had by my own cries aroused and attracted some wild beast, perhaps a mountain lion which had accidentally strayed within the cave. Perhaps I considered the Almighty had chosen for me a swifter and more merciful death than that of hunger. Yet the instinct of self-preservation, never wholly dormant, was stirred in my breast, and though escape from the oncoming peril might but spare me for a sterner and more lingering end, I determined nevertheless to part with my life at as high a price as I could command. Strange as it may seem, my mind convinced of no intent of the part of the visitor, save that of hostility. Accordingly, I became very quiet, in the hope that the unknown beast would, in the absence of the guiding sound, lose its direction as had I, and thus pass by me. But this hope was not destined for realization, for the strange footfall steadily advanced, the animal evidently having obtained my scent, which in an atmosphere so absolutely free from all distracting influences, as is that of the cave, could doubtless be followed at a great distance. Seeing therefore that I must be armed for defense against my uncanny and unseen attack in the dark, I groped about me the largest of the fragments of rock, which were strewn upon all parts of the floor of the cavern in the vicinity, and grasping one in each hand for immediate use, I waited with resignation the inevitable result. Meanwhile, the hideous pattering of the paws drew near. Certainly, the conduct of this creature was exceedingly strange. Most of the time, the tread seemed to be that of a quadruped, walking with a singular lack of unison betwixt hind and forefeet. Yet at brief and infrequent intervals, I fancied that 2 feet were engaged in the process of locomotion. I wondered what species of animal was to confront me. It must, I thought, be some unfortunate beast who had to pay for its curiosity to investigate one of the entrances of the fearful grotto, with a lifelong confinement in its interminable recesses. It doubtless obtained as food the eyeless fish, bats, and rats of the cave, as well as some of the ordinary fish that are wafted in at every freshet of the Green River, which communicates in some occult manner with the waters of the cave. I occupied my terrible vigil with grotesque conjectures of what alteration cave life might have wrought in the physical structure of the beast, remembering the awful appearances ascribed by local tradition to the consumptives who had died long after residence in the cave. Then I remembered, with a start, that even should I succeed in felling my antagonist, I should never behold its form, as my torch had long since been extinct, and I was entirely unprovided with matches. The tension on my brain now became frightful. My disordered fancy conjured up hideous and fearsome shapes from the sinister darkness that surrounded me, and that actually seemed to press upon my body. Nearer the dreadful footfalls approached. It seemed that I must give vent to a piercing scream. Yet, had I been sufficiently irresolute to attempt such a thing, my voice could scarce have responded. I was petrified, rooted to the spot. I was doubtful if my right arm would allow me to hurl its missile at the oncoming thing when the crucial moment should arrive. Now the steady pat of the steps were close at hand, now very close. I could hear the labored breathing of the animal, and terror-struck as I was, I realized that it must have come from the considerable distance and was correspondingly fatigued. Suddenly, the spell broke. My right hand, guided by my ever-trustworthy sense of hearing, threw with full force the sharp-angled bit of limestone which it contained, toward that point in the darkness from which emanated the breathing and pattering, and wonderful to relate, it nearly reached its goal, for I heard the thing jump, landing a distance away, where it seemed to pause. Having readjusted my aim, I discharged my second missile, this time most effectively. For a flood of joy, I listened as the creature fell in what sounded like a complete collapse and evidently remained prone and unmoving. Almost overpowered by the great relief which rushed over me, I reeled back against the wall. The breathing continued, in heavy, gasping inhalations and expirations, once I realized that I had no more than wounded the creature. And now, all desire to examine the thing ceased. At last, something allied to the groundless, superstitious fear had entered my brain. I did not approach the body, nor did I continue to cast stones at it in order to complete the extinction of its life. Instead, I ran at full speed in what was, as nearly as I could estimate in my frenzied condition, the direction from which I had come. Suddenly, I heard a sound, or rather, a regular succession of sounds. In another instant, they had resolved themselves into a series of sharp metallic clicks. This time there was no doubt. It was the guide. And then I shouted, yelled, screamed, even shrieked with joy, as I beheld in the vaulted arches above the faint and glimmering effulges which I knew to be the reflected light of the approaching torch. I ran to meet the flare, and before I could completely understand what had occurred, was lying on the ground at the feet of my guide, embracing his boots and gibbering, despite my boasted reserve, in the most meaningless and idiotic manner, pouring out my terrible story, and at that same time overwhelming my auditor with protestations of gratitude. At length I awoke to something like my normal consciousness. The guide had noted my absence upon the arrival of the party at the entrance of the cave, and had, from his intuitive sense of direction, proceeded to make a thorough canvass of the by-passages just up ahead, where he had last spoken to me, locating my whereabouts after a quest of about 4 hours. By the time he had related this to me, I, emboldened by his torch and his company, began to reflect upon the strange beast, which I had wounded but a short distance back in the darkness, and suggested that we ascertain by the flashlight's aid that manner of creature was my victim. Accordingly, I retraced my steps, this time with the courage born of companionship, to the scene of my terrible experience. Soon we described a white object upon the floor, an object whiter than even the glimmering limestone itself. Cautiously advancing, we gave vent to a simultaneous ejaculation of wonderment, for of all the unnatural monsters either of us in our lifetimes beheld, this was, in surpassing degree, the strangest. It appeared to be an anthropoid ape of large proportions, escaped perhaps from some itinerant menagerie. Its hair was snow white, a thing due no doubt to the bleaching actions of a long existence within the inky confines of the cave, but it was also surprisingly thin, being indeed largely absent save on the head, where it was of such length and abundance that it fell over the shoulders in considerable profusion. The face was turned away from us, as the creature lay almost directly upon it. The inclinations of the limbs were very singular, explaining however the alternations of its use which I had before noted, whereby the beast used sometimes all 4 and on other occasions but 2 for its progress. From the tips of its fingers or toes, long rat-like claws extended. The hands or feet were not prehensible, a fact that I ascribed to that long residence in the cave which, as I before mentioned, seemed evident from the all-pervading and almost unearthly whiteness so characteristic of the whole anatomy. No tail seemed to be present. The respiration had grown very feeble, and the guide had drawn his pistol with the evident intent of dispatching the creature, when a sudden sound emitted by the latter caused the weapon to fall unused. The sound was of a nature difficult to describe. It was not like the normal note of any known species of simian, and I wondered if the unnatural quality were not the result of a long-continued and complete silence, broken by the sensations produced by the advent of the light, a thing which the beast could not have seen since its first entrance into the cave. The sound, which I might feebly attempt to classify as a kind of deep-toned chattering, was faintly continued. All at once a fleeting spasm of energy seemed to pass through the frame of the beast. The paws went through a convulsion motion, and the limbs contracted. With a jerk, the white body rolled over so that its face was turned in our direction. For a moment, I was so struck with the horror at the eyes thus revealed that I noted nothing else. They were black, those eyes, deep jetty black in hideous contrast to the snow-white hair and flesh. Like those of other cave denizens, they were deeply sunken in their orbits, and they were entirely destitute of iris. As I looked more closely, I saw that they were set in a face less prognathous than that of the average ape, and indefinitely less hairy. The nose was quite distinct. As we gazed upon the uncanny sight presented in our vision, the thick lips opened and several sounds issued from them, after which the thing relaxed in death. The guide clutched my cloak sleeve and trembled so violently that the light shook fitfully, casting weird moving shadows on the walls. I made no motion, but stood rigidly still, my horrified eyes fixed upon the floor ahead. The fear left, and wonder, awe, compassion, and reverence succeeded in its place. For the sound uttered by the stricken figure that lay stretched out on the limestone had told us the awesome truth. The creature I had killed, the strange beast of the unfathomed cave, was, or had at one time, been a man. Story 2. Beyond the Wall of Sleep. I have often wondered if the majority of mankind has ever paused to reflect upon the occasional titanic significance of dreams, and of the obscure world to which they belong. Whilst the greater number of our nocturnal visions are perhaps no more than faint and frantic reflections of our waking experiences, Freud to the contrary with his puerile symbolism, there are still a certain remainder whose immundane and ethereal character permit of no ordinary interpretation, and whose vaguely exciting and disquieting effects suggest possible minute glimpses into a sphere of mental existence no less important than physical life, by an all but impassable barrier. From my experience, I cannot doubt but that man, who lost to terrestrial consciousness, is indeed sojourning in another and incorporeal life, of far different nature from the life we know, and of which only the slightest and most indistinct memories linger after waking. From those blurred and fragmented memories we may infer much, yet prove little. We may guess that in dreams, life, matter, and vitality, as the earth knows such things, are not necessarily constant, and that time and space do not exist as our waking selves comprehend them. Sometimes I believe that this less material life is our truer self, and that our vain presence on this terraqueous globe is itself the secondary or merely virtual phenomenon. It was from this youthful reverie, filled with speculation of this sort, that I arose one afternoon in the winter of 1901, when to the state psychiatric institution in which I served as an intern was brought the man whose case has ever since haunted me so unceasingly. His name, as given on the records, was Joe Slater, or Slaughter, and his appearance was that of the typical denizen of the Catskill Mountain region, one of those strange repellent scions of primitive colonial peasant stock, whose isolation for nearly 3 centuries in the hilly fastness of a little-traveled countryside has caused them to sink to a kind of barbaric degeneracy, rather than advance with their more fortunate placed brethren of the thickly settled districts. Among these odd folk, who correspond exactly to the decadent element of white trash in the South, law and morals are non-existent, and their general mental status is probably below that of any other section of Native American people. Joe Slater, who came to the institution in the vigilant custody of 4 state policemen, and who was described as a highly dangerous character, certainly presented no evidence of his perilous disposition when I first beheld him. Though well above the middle stature and of somewhat brawny frame, he was given an absurd appearance of harmless stupidity by the pale, sleepy blueness of his small, watery eyes, the scantiness of his neglected and never-shaven growth of yellow beard, and the listless drooping of his heavy nether lip. His age was unknown, since amongst his kind neither family record nor permanent family ties existed, but from the baldness of his head in front and from the decayed condition of his teeth, the head surgeon wrote him down as a man of about 40. From the medical and court documents, we learned all that we could gather from his case. This man, a vagabond, hunter, and trapper, had always been strange in the eyes of his primitive associates. He had habitually slept at night beyond the ordinary time, and upon waking, would often talk of unknown things in a manner so bizarre as to inspire fear, even in the hearts of an unimaginative populace. Not that his language was at all unusual, for he never spoke save at a debased pathos of his environment. But the tone and tenor of his utterance was of such mysterious wildness that none might listen without apprehension. He himself was generally as terrified and baffled as his auditors, and within an hour after waking, would forget all that he had said, or at least all that had caused him to say what he did, relapsing into a bovine half-amiable normality, like that of the other hill-dwellers. As Slater grew older, it appeared his matutine apparitions had gradually increased in frequency and violence, till about a month before his arrival at the institution had occurred the shocking tragedy which caused his arrest by the authorities. One day near noon, after a profound sleep begun in a whiskey debauch about 5 of the previous afternoon. The man had roused himself most suddenly, with ululations so horrible and unearthly that they brought several neighbors to his cabin, a filthy sty where he had dwelt with a family as indescribable as himself. Rushing out into the snow, he had flung his arms aloft and commenced a series of leaps directly upward in the air, the while shouting his determination to reach some big cabin with brightness on the roof and walls and floor, and the loud queer music far away. As 2 men of moderate size sought to restrain him, he had struggled with maniacal force and fury, screaming of his desire and need to find and kill a certain thing that shines and shakes and laughs. At length, after temporarily felling one of his detainers with a sudden blow, he had flung himself upon the other in a demonic ecstasy of bloodthirstiness, shrieking fiendlessly that he would jump high in the air and burn his way through anything that stopped him. Family and neighbors had now fled in a panic, and when the more courageous of them returned, Slater was gone, leaving behind an unrecognizable pulp-like thing that had been a living man but an hour before. None of the mountaineers had dared to pursue him, and it was likely that they would have welcomed his death from the cold. But when several mornings later they heard his screams from a distant ravine, they realized that he had somehow managed to survive, and that his removal in one way or another would be necessary. Then had followed an armed searching party, whose purpose, whatever it may have been originally, became that of the sheriff's posse, after one of the seldom popular state troopers had by accident observed, then questioned, and finally joined the seekers. On the 3rd day, Slater was found unconscious in the hollow of a tree, and taken to the nearest jail where alienists from Albany examined him as soon as his senses returned. To them he told a simple story. He had, he said, gone to sleep one afternoon, about sundown after drinking much liquor. He had awakened to find himself standing bloody-handed in the snow before his cabin, the mangled corpse of his neighbor, Peter Slater, at his feet. Horrified, he had taken to the woods in a vague effort to escape from the scene of what must have been his crime. Beyond these things, he seemed to know nothing, nor could the expert questioning of his interrogators bring out a single additional fact. That night, Slater slept quietly, and the next morning he awakened with no single feature save a certain alteration of expression. Dr. Bernard, who had been watching the patient, thought he noticed in his pale blue eyes a certain gleam of peculiar quality, and in the flaccid lips an all but imperceptible tightening, as if of intelligent determination. But when questioned, Slater relapsed into the habitual vacancy of the mountaineer, and only reiterated what he had said on the preceding day. On the 3rd morning occurred the first of the man's mental attacks. After some show of uneasiness and sleep, he burst forth into a frenzy so powerful that the combined efforts of 4 men were needed to bind him in a straitjacket. The alienists listened with keen attention to his words, since their curiosity had been aroused to a high pitch by the suggestive yet mostly conflicting and incoherent stories of his family and neighbors. Slater raved for the upwards of 15 minutes, babbling in the backwoods dialect of green edifices of light, oceans of space, strange music, and shadowy mountains and valleys. But most of all did he dwell upon some mysterious blazing entity that shook and laughed and mocked at him. This vast, vague personality seemed to have done him a terrible wrong, and to kill it in triumphant revenge was his paramount desire. In order to reach it, he said, he would soar through the abysses of emptiness, burning every obstacle that stood in his way. Thus ran his discourse, until with the greatest suddenness he ceased. The fire of madness died from his eyes, and in a dull wonder he looked at his questioners and asked why he was bound. Dr. Bernard unbuckled the leather harness and did not restore it until night, when he succeeded in persuading Slater to don it on of his own volition, for his own good. The man had now admitted that he sometimes talked queerly, though he knew not why. Within a week, 2 more attacks appeared, but from them the doctors learned little. On the source of Slater's vision they speculated at length, for since he could neither read nor write, and had apparently never heard a legend or a fairy tale, his gorgeous imagery was quite inexplicable. That it could not come from any known myth or romance was made especially clear by the fact that the unfortunate lunatic expressed himself only in his own simple manner. He raved of things he did not understand and could not interpret, things which he claimed to have experienced, but which he could not have learned through any normal or connected narration. The alienist soon agreed the abnormal dreams were the foundation of the trouble, dreams whose vividness could for a time completely dominate the waking mind of this basically inferior man. With due formality, Slater was tried for murder, acquitted on the grounds of insanity, and committed to the institution wherein I held so humble a post. I have said that I am a constant speculator concerning dream life, and from this you may judge of the eagerness which I applied myself to the study of the new patient as soon as I had fully ascertained the facts of his case. He seemed to sense a certain friendliness in me, born no doubt of the interest I could not conceal, and the gentle manner in which I questioned him. Not that he ever recognized me during his attacks, when I hung breathlessly upon his chaotic but cosmic word pictures, but he knew me in his quiet hours, when he would sit by his barred windows weaving baskets of straw and willow, and perhaps pining for the mountain freedom he could never enjoy again. His family never called to see him. Probably it had found another temporary head, after the manner of the decadent mountain folk. By degrees I commenced to feel an overwhelming wonder at the mad and fantastic conceptions of Joe Slater. The man himself was pitiable inferior, in mentality and language alike, but his glowing titanic visions, though described in barbarous disjointed jargon, were assuredly things which only a superior or even an exceptional brain could conceive. How, I often asked myself, could the stolid imaginations of a Catskill degenerate conjure up sights whose very possession argued a lurking spark of genius? How could any backwoods dullard have gained so much as an idea of those glittering realms of supernal radiance and space about which Slater ranted in his furious delirium? More and more I inclined to the belief that in this pitiful personality who cringed lay before me, lay the disordered nucleus of something beyond my comprehension. Something infinitely beyond the comprehension of my more experienced but less imaginative medical and scientific colleagues. And yet, I could extract nothing definite from the man. The sum of all my investigation was that in kind, of semi-corporeal dream life Slater wandered or floated through, resplendent in prodigious valleys, meadows, gardens, cities, and palaces of light, in a region unbound and unknown to man, that there he was no peasant or degenerate, but a creature of importance and vivid life, moving proudly and dominantly, and checked only by a certain deadly enemy, who seemed to be a being of visible yet ethereal structure, and who did not appear to be of human shape, since Slater never referred to it as a man, or as aught save a thing. This thing had done Slater some hideous but unnamed wrong, which the maniac, if maniac he were, yearned to avenge. From the manner in which Slater alluded to their dealings, I judged that he and the luminous thing had met on equal terms, that in his dream's existence the man was himself a luminous thing of the same race as his enemy. This impression was sustained by his frequent references to flying through space and burning all that impeded his progress, yet these conceptions were formulated in rustic words wholly inadequate to convey them. A circumstance which drove me to the conclusion that, if a dream world indeed existed, or a language was not its medium for the transmission of thought, could it be that the dream's soul inhabiting this inferior body was desperately struggling to speak things which the simple and halting tongue of the dullness could not utter? Could it be that I was face to face with intellectual emanations which would explain the mystery, if I could not but learn to discover and read them? I did not tell the older physicians of these things, for middle age is skeptical, cynical, and disinclined to accept new ideas. Besides, the head of the institution had but lately warned me in his paternal way that I was overworking, that my mind needed a rest. It had long been my belief that human thought consisted basically of atomic or molecular motion, convertible into ether waves or radiant energy like heat, light, and electricity. This belief had early led me to contemplate the possibility of telepathy, or mental communication by means of suitable apparatus. And I had in my college days prepared a set of transmitting and receiving instruments somewhat similar to the cumbrous devices employed in wireless telegraphy at that crude pre-radio period. These I had tested with fellow students, but achieving no results, had soon packed them away with other scientific odds and ends for possible future use. Now, in my intense desire to probe into the dream life of Joe Slater, I sought these instruments again and spent several days in repairing them for action. When they were complete once more, I missed no opportunity for their trial. At each outburst of Slater's violence, I would fit the transmitter to his forehead and the receiver to my own, constantly making delicate adjustments for various hypothetical wavelengths of intellectual energy. I had but little notion of how the thought impressions would, if successfully conveyed, arouse an intelligent response in my brain, but I felt certain that I could detect and interpret them. Accordingly, I continued my experiments, though informing no one of their nature. It was the 21st of February, 1901, that the thing occurred. As I look back across the years, I realize how unreal it seems, and sometimes wondered if old Dr. Fenton was not right when he charged it all to my excited imagination. I recall that he listened with great kindness and patience when I told him, but afterward gave me a nerve powder and arranged for half-year's vacation on which I departed the next week. That fateful night, I was wildly agitated and perturbed, for despite the excellent care he had received, Joe Slater was unmistakably dying. Perhaps it was his mountain freedom that he missed, or perhaps the turmoil in his brain had grown too acute for his rather sluggish physique. But at all events, the flame of vitality flickered low in the decadent body. He was drowsy near the end, and as darkness fell, he dropped off into a troubled sleep. I did not strap on the straitjacket, as was customary when he slept, since I saw that he was too feeble to be dangerous, even if he woke in mental disorder once more before passing away. But I did place upon his head and mine the two ends of my cosmic radio, hoping against hope for a first and last message from the dream world in the brief time remaining. In the cell with us was one nurse, a mediocre fellow who did not understand the purpose of the apparatus, earthing to inquire into my course. As the hours wore on, I saw his head droop awkwardly in sleep, but I did not disturb him. I myself, lulled by the rhythmic breathing of the heavily and dying man, must have nodded a little later. The sound of weird lyric melody was what aroused me. Chords, vibrations, and harmonic ecstasies echoed passionately on every hand, while on my ravished sight burst the stupendous spectacle of ultimate beauty. Walls, columns, and architraves of living fire blazed effulgently around the spot where I seemed to float in air, extending upwards to an infinitely high vaulted dome of indescribable splendor. Blending with the display of palatial magnificence, or rather supplanting it at times in a kaleidoscopic rotation, were glimpses of wide plains and graceful valleys, high mountains and inviting grottos, covered with every lovely attribute of scenery, which my delighted eyes can conceive of, yet formed wholly of something glowing, ethereal plastic entity, which in consistency partook as much of a spirit as matter. As I gazed, I perceived that my own brain held the key to these enchanting metamorphoses, for each vista which appeared to me was the one my changing mind most wished to behold. Amidst this Elysian realm, I dwelt not as a stranger, for each sight and sound was familiar to me, just as it had been for uncounted eons for eternity before, and would be like for eternities to come. Then, the resplendent aura of my brother of light drew near and held a colloquy with me, soul to soul with silent and perfect interchange of thought. The hour was one of approaching triumph, for was not my fellow being escaping at last from degrading periodic bondage, escaping forever, and preparing to follow the accursed oppressor even unto the utmost fields of ether, that upon it might be wrought a flaming cosmic vengeance, which would shake the spheres. We floated thus for a little time, when I perceived a slight burning and fading of objects around us, as though some force were recalling me to earth, where I least wished to go. The form near me seemed to feel a change also, for I gradually brought its discourse towards a conclusion, and itself prepared to quit the scene, fading from my sight at a rate somewhat less rapid than that of other objects. A few more thoughts were exchanged, and I knew that the luminous one and I were being recalled to bondage, though for my brother of light, it would be the last time. The sorry planet shell being well nigh spent, in less than an hour, my fellow would be free to pursue the oppressor along the Milky Way and pass the hither stars to the very confines of infinity. A well-defined shock separates my final impression of the fading scene of light from my sudden and somewhat shamefaced awakening and straightening up in my chair as I saw the dying figure on the couch move hesitantly. Joe Slater was indeed awakening, though probably for the last time. As I looked more closely, I saw that in the sallow cheeks shone spots of color which had never before been present. The lips, too, seemed unusual, being tightly compressed, as if by the force of a stronger character than had been Slater's. The whole face finally began to grow tense, and the head turned restlessly with closed eyes. I did not rouse the sleeping nurse, but readjusted the slightly disarranged headband of my telepathic radio, intent to catch any parting message the dreamer might have to deliver. All at once the head turned sharply in my direction, and the eyes fell open, causing me to stare in a blank amazement at what I beheld. The man who had been Joe Slater, the Catskill decadent, was gazing at me with a pair of luminous expanding eyes, whose blue seemed suddenly to have deepened. Neither mania nor degeneracy was visible in that gaze, and I felt beyond a doubt that I was viewing a face behind which lay an active mind of high order. At this juncture, my brain became aware of a steady external influence operating upon it. I closed my eyes to concentrate my thoughts more profoundly, and was rewarded by the positive knowledge that my long-sought mental message had come at last. Each transmitted idea formed rapidly in my mind, and though no actual language was employed, my habitual association of conception and expression was so great that I seemed to be receiving the message in ordinary English.
"Joe Slater is dead,"
came the soul-petrifying voice of an agency from beyond the wall of sleep. My opened eyes sought the couch of pain and curious horror, but the blue eyes were still calmly gazing, and the countenance was still intelligently animated.
"He is better dead, for he was unfit to bear the active intellect of a cosmic entity. His gross body could not undergo the needed adjustments between the ethereal life and planet life. He was too much an animal, too little a man. Yet it is through his deficiency that you have come to discover me, for the cosmic and planet souls rightly should never meet. He has been my torment and diurnal prison for 42 of your terrestrial years. I am an entity like that which you become yourself in the freedom of dreamless sleep. I am your brother of light, and to have floated with you in the effulgent valleys, it is not permitted me to tell your waking earth self of your real self. But we are all roamers of vast spaces and travelers of many ages. Next year I may be dwelling in the Egypt which you call ancient, or in the cruel emperor of San Shan, which is to come 3,000 years hence. You and I have drifted to the worlds that reel about the red Arcturus, and dwelt in the bodies of the insect philosophers that crawl proudly over the fourth moon of Jupiter. How little does the Earth self know life and its extent? How little indeed ought it to know for its own tranquility. Of the oppressor I cannot speak. You on Earth have unwittingly felt its distant presence. You, who without knowing idly gave the blinking beacon the name Elgoth, the demon star. It is to meet and conquer the oppressor that I have vainly striven for eons, held back by bodily encumbrances. Tonight, I go as a nemesis bearing just and blazing cataclysmic vengeance. Watch me in the sky, close by the demon star. I cannot speak longer, for the body of Joe Slater grows cold and rigid, and the coarse brains are ceasing to vibrate as I wish. You have been my only friend on this planet, the only soul to sense and seek for me within the repellent form which lies on this couch. We shall meet again, perhaps in the shining midst of Orion's sword, perhaps on the bleak plateau in the prehistoric Asia, perhaps in the unremembered dreams tonight, perhaps in some other form an eon hence, when the solar system shall have been swept away.
At this point, the thought waves abruptly ceased, and the pale eyes of the dreamer, or can I say dead man, commenced to glaze fishily. In a half-stupor, I crossed over to the couch and felt his wrist, but I found it cold, stiff and pulseless. The sallow cheeks paled again, and the thick lips fell open. disclosing the repulsively rotten fangs of the degenerate Joe Slater. I shivered, pulled a blanket over his hideous face, and awakened the nurse. Then, I left the cell and went silently to my room. I had an instant and unaccountable craving for a sleep whose dreams I should not remember. The climax? What plain tale of science can boast of such rhetorical effect? I've merely set down certain things appealing to me as facts, allowing you to construe them as you will. As I have already admitted, my superior old Dr. Fenton denies the reality of everything I have related. He vows that I was broken down with nervous strain and badly in need of a long vacation on full pay, which he so generously gave me. He assures me on his professional honor that Joe Slater was but a low-grade paranoiac, whose fantastic notions must have come from the crude hereditary folktales which circulated in even the most decadent of communities. All this he tells me, yet I cannot forget what I saw in the sky on that night after Slater died. Lest you think me a biased witness, another pen must add this final testimony, which may perhaps supply the climax you expect. I will quote the following account of the Nova Persei verbatim, from the pages of that eminent astronomical authority, Professor Garrett P. Service. On February 22nd, 1901, a marvelous new star was discovered by Dr. Anderson Edinburgh, not very far from Algo. No star had been visible at this point before. Within 24 hours, the stranger had become so bright that it outshone Capella. In a week or two, it had visibly faded, and in the course of a few months, it was hardly discernible with the naked eye. Story 3. The Festival. I was far from home when the spell of Eastern Sea was upon me. In the twilight, I heard it pounding on the rocks, and I knew it lay just over the hill where the twisting willows writhed against the clearing sky and the first stars of the evening. And because my fathers had called me to the old town beyond, I pushed through the shallow new-fallen snow, along the road that soared lonely up to where the Aldebaran twinkled among the trees, on toward the very ancient town I had never seen, but often dreamed of. It was the Yuletide, that men call Christmas, though they know in their hearts it is older than Bethlehem and Babylon, older than Memphis and mankind. It was the Yuletide, and I had come at last to the ancient sea town where my people had dwelt and kept festival in their elder time, when festival was forbidden, where also they had commanded their sons to keep festival once every century, that the memory of primal secrets might not be forgotten. Mine were an old people, and were old even when this land was settled 300 years ago. And they were strange, because they had come as dark furtive folk from opiate southern gardens of orchids, and spoke another tongue before they learned the tongue of the blue-eyed fishers. And now they were scattered, and shared only the rituals of mysteries that none living could understand. I was the only one who came back that night to the old fishing town as legend bade, for only the poor and the lonely remember. Then, beyond the hill's crest, I saw Kingsport outspread frostedly in the gloamy, snowy Kingsport with its ancient vanes and steeples, ridgepoles and chimney pots, wharves and small bridges, willow trees and graveyards, endless labyrinths of steep, narrow, crooked streets and dizzy church-crowned central peaks that time durst not touch. Ceaseless mazes of colonial houses, piled and scattered at all angles, and levels like a child's disordered blocks. Iniquity hovering on gray wings over wintered whitened gables and gambrel roofs. Fanlights and small paned windows, one by one gleaming out in the cold dusk to join Orion and the archaic stars. And against the rotting wharves the sea pounded, the secretive immemorial sea out of which the people had come in their elder time. Beside the road at its crest, a still higher summit rose, bleak and windswept, and I saw that it was a burying ground, where black gravestones stuck ghoulishly through the snow like the decayed fingernails of a gigantic corpse. The printless road was very lonely, and sometimes I thought I heard a distant horrible creak, as of a gibbet in the wind. They had hanged 4 kinsmen of mine for witchcraft in 1692, but I did not know just where. As the road wound down the seaward slope, I listened for the merry sounds of a village at evening, but did not hear them. Then I thought of the season, and felt that these old Puritan folk might well have Christmas customs strange to me, and full of silent hearthside prayer. So after that I did not listen for merriment or look for wayfarers. Kept on down past the hushed lighted farmhouses and shadowy stone walls to where the signs of ancient shops and sea taverns creaked in the salt breeze, and the grotesque knockers of pillared doorways glistened along deserted unpaved lanes in the light of little curtained windows. I had seen maps of this town and knew where to find the home of my people. It was told that I should be known and welcomed, for village legend lives long. So I hastened through back streets, a circle court, and across the fresh snow on the one full flagstone pavement in the town, to where Green Lane leads off behind the market house. The old map still held good, and I had no trouble, though at Arkham they must have lied when they said that the trolley ran to this place, since I saw not a wire overhead. Snow would have hid the rails in any case, and I was glad I had chosen to walk, for the white village had seemed very beautiful from the hill. And now I was eager to knock at the door of my people, the 7th house on the left in the Green Lane, with an ancient peaked roof and a jutting second story, all built before 1650. There were lights inside the house when I came upon it, and I saw from the diamond window panes that it must have been kept very close to its antique state. The upper part overhung the narrow grass-grown street, and nearly met the overhanging part of the house opposite, so that I was almost in a tunnel with the low stoop doorstep wholly free from the snow. There was no sidewalk. But many houses had high doors reached by double flights of steps with iron railings. It was an odd scene, and because I was strange to New England, I had never known its like before. Though it pleased me, I would have relished it better if there had been footprints in the snow, and people in the streets, and a few windows without drawn curtains. When I sounded the archaic iron knocker, I was half afraid. Some fear had gathered in me, perhaps because of the strangeness of my heritage and the bleakness of the evening, and the queerness of the silence in that aged town of curious customs. And when my knock was answered, I was fully afraid, because I had not heard any footsteps before the door creaked open. But I was not afraid for long, for the gowned, slippered old man in the doorway had a bland face that reassured me. And though he made signs that he was dumb, he wrote a quaint and ancient welcome with the stylus and wax tablet he carried. He beckoned me in the low candlelit room, with massive exposed rafters and dark, stiff, sparse furniture from the 17th century. The past was vivid there, for not an attribute was missing. There was a cavernous fireplace, and a spinning wheel at which a bent old woman in loose wrapper and deep poke bonnet sat back towards me, silently spinning despite the festive season. An indefinite dampness seemed to be upon the place, and I marveled that no fire should be blazing. The high-backed, settled-faced, the row of curtained windows at the left, and seemed to be occupied, though I was not sure. I did not like everything about what I saw, and felt again the fear I had had. This fear grew stronger from what had before lessened it, for the more I looked at the old man's bland face, the more its very blandness terrified me. The eyes never moved, and the skin was too much like wax. Finally, I was sure it was not a face at all, but a fiendishly cunning mask. But the flabby hands, curiously gloved, wrote gently on the tablet, and told me I must wait a while before I could be led to the place of the festival. Pointing to a chair, table, and pile of books, the old man now left the room, and when I sat down to read, I saw that the books were hoary and moldy, and that they included the old Morrister's wild marvels of science. The terrible Seducimus Triumphus of Joseph Granville, published in 1681. The shocking Dima en Lettres of Remigius, printed in 1595 at Lyon. And worst of all, the unmentionable Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. An Olaus Warmius, forbidden Latin translation, a book which I had never seen, but of which I heard monstrous things whispered. No one spoke to me, but I could hear the creaking of signs in the wind outside, and the whir of the wheel as the bonneted old woman continued her silent spinning. I thought the room and the books and the people very morbid and disquieting. But because an old tradition of my father's had summoned me to strange feastings, I resolved to expect queer things. So I tried to read, and soon became tremblingly absorbed by something I found in that accursed Necronomicon. A thought and a legend too hideous for sanity or consciousness, but I disliked it when I fancied I heard the closing of one of the windows that the settle faced, as if it had been stealthily opened. It had seemed to follow a whirring that was not of the old woman's spinning wheel. This was not much, though, for the old woman was spinning very hard, and the age clock had been striking. After that, I lost the feeling that there was a person on the settle, and was reading intently and shudderingly when the old man came back booted and dressed in a loose antique costume, and sat down on that very bench, so that I could not see him. It was certainly nervous waiting, and the blasphemous book in my hand made it doubly so. When 11 struck, however, the old man stood up, glided to a massive carved chest in the corner, and got 2 hooded cloaks, one of which he donned, and the other of which he draped around the old woman, who was ceasing her monotonous spinning. Then, they both started for the outer door, the woman lamely creeping and the old man, after picking up the very book I had been reading, beckoning me as he drew his hood over his unmoving face, or mask. We went out into the moonless and tortuous network of that incredibly ancient town, went out as the lights in the curtained windows disappeared, one by one, and the dog star leered as the throng of cowled, cloaked figures that poured silently from every doorway and formed monstrous processions up this street and that, past the creaking signs and the antediluvian gables, the thatched roofs and the diamond-paned windows, threading precipitous lanes where decaying houses overlapped and crumbled together, gliding across open courts and churchyards where the bobbing lathorns made eldritch drunken constellations. Amid these hushed throngs I followed my voiceless guides, that seemed preternaturally soft, impressed by chests and stomachs that seemed abnormally pulpy, but seeing never a face and hearing never a word. Up, 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 the eerie column slithered, and I saw that all the travelers were converging as they flowed near sort of a focused crazy alleys at the top of a hill in the center of the town, where perched a great white church. I had seen it from the road's crest when I looked at the Kingsport in the new dusk, and it had made me shiver because Aldebaran had seemed to balance itself a moment on the ghostly spire. There was an open space around the church, partly a churchyard with spectral shafts, and a partly half-paved square swept nearly bare of snow by the wind, and lined with unwholesomely archaic houses, having peaked roofs and overhanging gables. Death fires danced over the tombs, revealing gruesome vistas, though queerly failing to cast any shadow. Past the churchyard where there were no houses, I could see over the hill's summit and watch the glimmer of stars on the harbor, though the town was invisible in the dark. Only once in a while, a lantern bobbed horribly through the serpentine alleys, on its way to overtake the throng that was now slipping speechlessly into the church. I waited till the crowd had oozed into the black doorway, until all the stragglers had followed. The old man was pulling at my sleeve, but I was determined to be the last. Crossing the threshold into the swarming temple of unknown darkness, I turned once to look at the outside world as the churchyard's phosphorescence cast a sickly glow on the hilltop pavement. As I did so, I shuddered, for though the wind had not left much snow, a few patches did remain on the path near the door, and in that fleeting backward look, it seemed to my troubled eyes that they bore no mark of passing feet, not even mine. The church was scarce lighted by all the lanthorns that had entered it, for the most of the throng had already vanished. They had streamed up the aisle between the high pews to the trap door of the vault which yawned loathsomely open just before the pulpit, and were now squirming noiselessly in. I followed dumbly down the foot-worn steps and into the dark, suffocating crypt. The tale of that sinuous line of the night marchers seemed very horrible, and as I saw them wiggle into that venerable tomb, they seemed more horrible still. Then I noticed that the tomb's floor had an aperture down which the throng was sliding, and in that moment we were all descending an ominous staircase of rough-hewn stone, a narrow spiral staircase damp and peculiarly odorous that wound endlessly down into the bowels of the hill, past monotonous walls of dripping stone blocks and crumbling mortar. It was a silent, shocking descent, and I observed after a horrible interval that the walls and the steps were changing in nature, as if chiseled out of solid rock. What mainly troubled me was that the myriad footfalls made no sound and set up no echoes. After more eons of descent, I saw some side passages of burrows leading from unknown recesses of blackness to this shaft of night and mystery. Soon, They became excessively numerous, like impious catacombs of nameless menace, and their pungent odor of decay grew quite unbearable. I knew we must have passed down through the mountain and beneath the earth of the Kingsport itself, and I shivered that a town should be so aged and maggoty was subterraneous evil. Then, I saw the lurid shimmering of pale light and heard the insidious lapping of sunless waters. Again I shivered, for I did not like the thing that the night had brought, and wished bitterly that no forefather had summoned me to this primal rite. As the steps and the passage grew broader, I heard another sound, the thin, whiny mockery of the feeble flute, and suddenly, there spread out before me the boundless vista of an inner world, a vast fungus shore lit by the belching column of a sick greenish flame, and washed by a wide oily river that flowed from abysses frightful and unsuspected to join the blackest gulfs of immemorial ocean. Fainting and gasping, I looked at that unhallowed Erebus of Titan toadstools, leprous fire and slimy water, and saw the cloaked throng forming a semicircle around the blazing pillar. It was the Yuletide rite, older than man and fated to survive him, the primal rite of the solstice and of the spring promise beyond the snows, the rite of fire and evergreen, light and music. And in the Stygian grotto, I saw them do the rite, and adore the sick pillar of flame, and threw into the water handfuls of gouged out of the viscerous vegetation which glittered green in the chlorotic glare. I saw this, and I saw something amorphously squatted far away from the light, piping noisomely on a flute, and as the thing piped, I thought I heard the noxious muffled flutterings in the foetid darkness, where I could not see. But what frightened me most was the flaming column, spouting volcanically from the depths profound and inconceivable, casting no shadows, as healthy flame should, and coating the nitrous stone with nasty venomous verdigris. For in all that seething combustion, no warmth lay, but only the clamness of death and corruption. The man who had brought me now squirmed to a point directly beside the hideous flame, and made stiff ceremonial motions to the semicircle he faced. At certain stages of the ritual, they did grovel obeisance, especially when he held above his head that abhorrent necromonicon he had taken with him, and I shared all the obeisance because I had been summoned to this festival by the writings of my forefathers. Then, the old man made a signal to the half-seen flute player in the darkness, which player thereupon changed its feeble drone to a scarce louder drone in another key, precipitating as it did so a horror unthinkable and unexpected. At this horror, I sat nearly to the lichened earth, transfixed with dread, not of this or any world, but only of the mad spaces between the stars. Out of the unimaginable blackness beyond the gangrenous glare of that cold flame, out of the Tartarian leagues through which that oily river rolled uncanny, unheard and unsuspected, there flopped rhythmically a horde of tame, trained hybrid winged things that no sound eye could ever wholly grasp, or sound brain ever wholly remember. They were not altogether crows, nor moles, nor buzzards, nor ants, nor vampire bats, nor decomposed human beings, but something I cannot and must not recall. They flopped limply along, half with their webbed feet and half with their membranous wings, and as they reached the throng of celebrants, the cowled figures seized and mounted them, and rode off one by one along the reaches of that unlighted river into pits and galleries of panic, where poisoned springs feed frightful and undiscoverable cataracts. The old spinning woman had gone with the throng, and the old man remained only because I had refused when he motioned me to seize an animal and ride like the rest. I saw when I staggered to my feet that the amorphous flute player had rolled out of sight, but the two of the beasts were patiently standing by. As I hung back, the old man produced his stylus and tablet, and wrote that he was the true deputy of my fathers, who had founded the Yule worship in this ancient place, that it had been decreed that I should come back and that the most secretive mysteries were yet to be performed. He wrote this in the very ancient hand, and when I had hesitated, he pulled from his loose robe a seal ring and a watch, both with my family arms, to prove that he was what he said. But it was hideous proof, because I knew from old papers that that watch had been buried with my great-great-great-grandfather in 1698. Presently, the old man drew back his hood and pointed to the family resemblance in his face, but I only shuddered, because I was sure that that face was merely a devilish waxen mask. The flopping animals were now scratching relentlessly at the lichens, and I saw that the old man was nearly as restless himself. When one of the things began to waddle and edge away, he turned quickly to stop it, so that the suddenness of his motion dislodged the waxen mask from what should have been his head. And then, because that nightmare's position barred me from the stone staircase down which we had come, I flung myself into the oily underground river that bubbled somewhere to the caves of the sea, flung myself into the putrescent juices of the earth's inner horrors, before the madness of my screams could bring down upon me all the charnel legions these pest gulfs might conceal. At the hospital, they told me I had been found half frozen in the Kingsport harbor at dawn, clinging to the drifting spar that accident sent to save me. They told me I had taken the wrong fork of the hill road the night before and had fallen over the cliffs at Orange Point, a thing they deduced from prints found in the snow. There was nothing I could say because everything was wrong. Everything was wrong, with the broad windows showing a sea of roofs, in which only about 1 in 5 were ancient, and the sound of trolleys and motors on the streets below. They insisted that this was Kingsport, and I could not deny it. When I went delirious at hearing that the hospital stood near the old churchyard on Center Hill, they sent me to St. Mary's Hospital in Arkham, where I could have better care. I liked it there, for the doctors were broad-minded, and even lent me their influences in obtaining the carefully sheltered copy of Alhazred's objectable Necronomicon from the library of Miskatonic University. They said something about a psychosis and agreed I had better get any harassing obsessions off my mind. So I read that hideous chapter and shuddered doubly because it was indeed not new to me. I had seen it before, let footprints tell what they might, and where it was I had seen it, it were best forgotten. There was no one in waking hours who could remind me of it, but my dreams are filled with terror because of phrases I dare not quote. I dare not quote only one paragraph, put into such English as I can make from the awkward low Latin. The nethermost caverns, wrote the mad Arab, are not for the fathoming of eyes that see, for their marvels are strange and terrific. Curse the ground where dead thoughts live, new and oddly bodied, and evil the mind that is held by no head. Wisely did Ibn Shakabak say, that happy is the tomb where no wizard hath lain, and happy the town at night whose wizards are all ashes. For it is of old rumor that the soul of the devil-bought hastes not from his charnel clay, but fats and instructs the very worm that gnaws, till out of corruption horrid life springs, and the dull scavengers of earth wax crafty to vex it, and swell monstrous to plague it. Great holes secretly are digged where earth's pores ought to suffice, and things have learned to walk that ought to crawl.